January was a pretty good reading month for me. Technically I only had one 5-star read, but I'm a pretty harsh judge when it comes to my star ratings, so honestly even getting one 5-star is pretty good for me, and I didn't have anything below 3 stars for this month, so I'm pretty happy with that. Let's take a look at what I read and I will give you my thoughts on every book that I read in January. I also read 6 books this month, which is probably the most books that I've read in a single month in a very long time, if not ever. So I'm really excited to be getting so much back into reading and to be sharing with you guys what I read and what I thought of everything. So let's get to book number 1. So the first book I finished in January. If you watched any of my 30 soft vlogs, you will know exactly what this book is, and it is of course Fourth Wing. I finished Fourth Wing on the 3rd of January. Sorry, my laptop is behind the camera, so if I start looking weirdly over there, I'm looking at my laptop, which has all my notes on it. So yes, I read Fourth Wing by Rebecca Yarros, finally jumping on to the Fourth Wing Empyrean train. And I really liked this book. This was my one 5-star read for the entire month. I loved it. It was a lot of fun. If you can have really deep analytical thoughts about it and you want to really be challenged in your thinking while reading a book, this is not the book for you. If you just want to chill out, have a good time, have a read. If you like fantasy or romance or anything along those lines, I would definitely recommend this book. It is not too difficult to get into in terms of fantasy side of things, but it is enough that it's not just a romance book. I didn't even actually tell you anything about it. So this book follows Violet Sorrengale, who becomes a cadet in the Riders Quadrant, which is the section of this war college that trains people up to be dragon riders, and then they become dragon riders and go off and fight in the war. So Violet had always planned on being a scribe. She's pretty small, she's pretty weak, she's not been training to go into any sort of fighting position, but about 6 months before she's supposed to enroll, her mother decides that she has to become a dragon rider. Now her mother is general of the war college that they attend, so she has a lot of power and a lot of influence, especially in this decision. So Violet ends up having to go to the Riders Quadrant, which is a really scary place. Lots of people die trying to get through the Riders Quadrant, just trying to get to the entry point to the Riders Quadrant. Many people will die. So yeah, this follows Violet as she tries to actually become strong enough to survive the Riders Quadrant. And yeah, along the way she makes some friends, she gets involved in some relationships. It's a lot of fun and it involves dragons and fighting, and yeah, it's very fun, very fast paced. Would definitely recommend if you are just looking for something a little bit fun. So that's Fourth Wing. That was my 5 stars. That was my first book of January. Next up, I continued the Once Upon a Broken Heart series, The Ballad of Never After. So if you hadn't heard of this series, we are following, it's been a while since I read it, what are their names? We're following Evangeline, who is just a young girl trying to find her happily ever after. They're very heavily fairy tale influenced. Like, I wouldn't call this a fantasy, I would call it a fairy tale. It is of course also a fantasy, but I guess subgenre wise it would definitely be fairy tale. It's not as happy as Disney fairy tale. I described it at the time as being somewhere between a Disney fairy tale and a Grimm Brothers fairy tale. They're not quite as dark and depressing as Grimm Brothers, but they're definitely not as just happy-go-lucky as a Disney movie. So somewhere in between. Definitely some bad things happening, definitely some good things happening. And yeah, we follow Evangeline trying to find love and find her happily ever after. This is the second book in the series. I think this one is the best out of the trilogy. It still only gave it 4 stars, but I did really enjoy this one. If you're looking to really analyze things and really get deep into the world and the lore, and you really want a strong backstory and strong world building and really strong writing, this probably isn't for you, but it was a very fun little book. Again, very fast paced, very quick read. 4 stars from Stephanie Garber. And then I don't have much to say about the next one because it is A Curse for True Love, which is the 3rd book in the Once Upon a Broken Heart trilogy. So basically I have the same thing to say about it as The Ballad of Never After. I've heard a lot of people say that this book didn't end well, is what I feel like I've heard people say, but now that I've read it, I feel like it's more that they think that this book didn't end the series well. I definitely don't think it was as good as the 2nd book. It definitely pulled some stuff back and we didn't get as much of the elements that we probably would have liked to get out of this book after what happened in the 2nd book, but I still really enjoyed it. It was a fun little read. It does end happily, but the rest of the book was, yeah, probably not the best, but I did still give it 4 stars, so yeah, good read. Oh, and I finished the Ballad of Never After. I finished on the 6th of January. This one I finished on the 10th of January. Next up we have Yellowface by R.F. Kuang. This is a very well written book. If you don't know anything about this book, in it we follow June, who is a really good friend of Athena, who was a really famous Asian American author. She was doing very well for herself. They met while they were in college studying literature together. So June also really wanted to become a writer, and so having Athena there as sort of her friendly rival was really hard for her to deal with. She really struggled with a lot of jealousy around her relationship between herself and Athena. But suddenly, unexpectedly, Athena dies, which it's within basically the 1st chapter, so not really spoilers, but if you're really concerned about that, I'm sorry. But Athena dies and June steals the manuscript that she has written but not published and that she hasn't shown to anyone. So June steals it and tries to sell it off as her own. She goes through the process of trying to publish a book. She gets a really good agent, a really good publisher. They all pick it up. Everyone's really excited about this book. They change her name from June Hayward to June Song, which is her middle name, so it's not just a completely fabricated name. But this is definitely a book that is focused on the Asian history of, I believe it's World War I, a very Asian history focus on World War I. So it doesn't really make sense from a promotional standpoint to have a white American writing a book about Asian history. So they sort of try to make her a little bit more culturally ambiguous. Since Athena, the one who wrote it, is in fact Asian American, it made a lot of sense for her to write it. But when we now have June trying to publish it, yes, they try to make June a little bit more culturally ambiguous in order to be able to sell the book a little bit better and make it more believable that she would write this sort of book. But of course, at various points in time throughout this book, everything blows up. People are questioning her whether or not she was the one to write it, whether or not she should have been the one to write it. I don't know, I'm not up on political stuff enough to really want to say my opinion about some of these sorts of things. I thought this book was incredibly well written. June is a terrible person, and we are reading this from her perspective in 1st person, and it's really interesting to read the inner monologue of someone that is just not a very nice person. She's racist, she's jealous, she's rude, but she always explains it off within her own brain as something that's not actually being bad. That's just how she is, and actually she has good reasoning for all of these things, but all of her reasoning is terrible. But it's really interesting to read that in a 1st person's perspective and know that the person is terrible without them knowing, but still somehow to become attached to these characters and start to care about what happens to this character while still knowing that she's a terrible person. It was a very well written book. I'm only giving it 3 stars. For me, it's just not my genre. I'm much more of a fantasy sort of reader rather than like literary fiction, but I'm definitely going to be picking up some of R.F. Kuang's fantasy books. I've heard, is it Babel or Babel? It looks like it's written like Babel to me, but I hear a lot of people call it Babel. So I don't know which one it is, but I'm probably going to be picking that one up. Not super soon, but at some point in the near future, because I did really love her writing and I think she is a very talented author. So yeah, that was Yellowface. 3 stars for that one, and I finished it on the 15th of January. Next up we have Divine Rivals? Next up we have Divine Rivals by Rebecca Russ. This was another like cutesy sort of one, probably not super deep in any of that fantasy and world building sort of elements, but it is a bit of a fantasy romance young adult book, and I thought it was very cute. We follow Iris here, who her brother has gone off to war, and she starts writing letters to him on her typewriter and sending them just through her closet in her room. Makes no sense at all, but the letters disappear. So she's been spending all of this time writing to her brother, and when this book picks up, we discover that Roman is actually the one receiving these letters, not her brother. And he writes her back to say, hey, I'm not actually a brother. This is after he's received like 15 letters from her writing to her brother. She finally tells him that actually it's not her brother. But these two actually work together. So she does not know that it's Roman that's writing to her, but Roman knows that it is in fact Iris, and they work together at the newspaper, hence the rivals. They are both fighting for a promotion and a permanent columnist position. A permanent columnist position with the newspaper. So yeah, this is their story. It doesn't actually, I will say, because I really enjoyed part 1 of this book, where it was just the two of them hanging around writing for their newspaper in this sort of steampunk 1930s-esque world. I really enjoyed that, but that's only throughout part 1. Part 2, they change it up. They go in a different direction, in a different place. So definitely be prepared for that change if you, like me, are really enjoying the newspaper world specifically. I also felt that the romance felt a little bit rushed. Like, obviously it was happening throughout the entire book, but once it sort of kicked off, it kicked off a lot very quickly. So it wasn't my favorite, it wasn't the best written book. I'm still giving it 4 stars because it was a lot of fun to read. It was a very fun little read, very quick again. Nice little quick read. 4 stars. It was pretty good, but not amazing. I'm looking forward to reading the next one. This one's just a duology. Ruthless Vows just came out at the start of this year or late last year, so it is pretty new, and I'm going to be reading that one in the near future and seeing how this story concludes. On that note, if anyone has any recommendations for like 1930s newspaper stories, let me know. Because I really loved this 1930s world. If it's fantasy, that's cool. If it's not fantasy, that's also fine. I'm okay with that. But yeah, the part 1, loved it. The rest of it was pretty good. I mean, I gave it 4 stars, so obviously it was pretty good. But I would have given part 1 5 stars. And finally, the last book that I read in January was Iron Flame by Rebecca Russ. Yes, I loved Fourth Wing so much that I immediately went out and bought Iron Flame and then put myself on a book buying ban for the rest of January because I spent too much money on books in December and have since spent too much money on books in February. But we're not going to talk about that. Instead, we're going to talk about Iron Flame. There's been a lot of negativity around this book. I don't think it deserves the full hate that it's getting. Do I think it was as good as Fourth Wing? No. But do I still think it was a very fun book and still a really enjoyable read? Yes. Yes, I do. This one was 4 stars. I mean, it's just the continuation of the storyline. I don't think there's anything extra to say about what the storyline of this book is without spoiling anything from Fourth Wing. But we're just continuing to follow Violet as she makes her way through the War College with her dragon and her friends and her relationships. So, continuation of that. It's written in 2 parts. Part 1 of this book I absolutely loved. Throughout the entire part 1 I was like, what is everyone talking about? Why do they think bad things about this one? There were a couple of small things, there were a couple of just little timeline inaccuracies that didn't quite line up with what was happening and what was supposed to be happening. They didn't make sense. But it was a couple of times. It was totally fine. I didn't mind that much. The other thing that I didn't like was that they brought in 2 new characters at the start of the book who seemed like they were going to be a really heavy part of this story. But then they just kind of ignored them, like they were around all the time, but we never got any character development, we never really got any backstory, there wasn't really any depth or substance to these two new characters, which is definitely a shame. There was one point in the book where one of them drops like a big reveal on Violet, and then the chapter ends and then we just move on. Like it didn't happen. It comes up a little bit later, sort of, but they never really have a conversation about what is said, so it's a bit odd in that sense, but I loved it. They had other characters that I didn't expect to show up quite as much as they did in this book. Those characters had some really great character development throughout this book, so yeah, I really loved part 1. Part 2 definitely slows down a lot. Part 1 and Fourth Wing were like, you just read straight through them. They were very quick reads. But part 2, yeah, it really slowed down a bit. I don't think it was necessarily bad. It was definitely just a little bit different. And yeah, a bit slower, which one of the main things that I liked about Fourth Wing was that it was just so quick and so light and easy to read. Whereas part 2 of Iron Flame just kind of got a little bit deep and meaningful, a bit slow. I wouldn't really say deep and meaningful, but it did slow down and definitely had some additional things thrown in there that I probably wouldn't have put in myself. Not that I would be able to write anything even close to this, but I still really enjoyed it. If you enjoyed Fourth Wing, don't be afraid of all of the negativity that Iron Flame is getting. Obviously there's a chance you may not like it, but there's always a chance you may not like a book, and just from my perspective, as me having read this, I would say that it doesn't deserve the amount of hate that it is getting. But not quite as good as Fourth Wing, so 4 stars. And this one I finished on the 28th of January, so right at the end of the month. So those are all of the books that I read in January of 2024. I am also working through a couple of like reading challenges. So the first one is the Dimmicks reading challenge, which they've got the book tasting menu this year. Very disappointed that they're not giving away free pins anymore, but we're still going to try to complete this. We'll see how it goes. Basically what they've done is they've taken the concept of a tasting menu and made it into a reading challenge. So this one goes from January to March, and then from April to June I assume they're going to be doing a different course. So this is entrees, so we've got things like New Beginnings, a book to motivate you to the year ahead, or perhaps the first book in a series. Aesthetic Appetizer, you don't judge a book by a cover, do you? Local Flavours, sample the local literary scene and celebrate our talented Australian authors. Things like that. So I have ticked off a few things off this. So I did achieve the Aesthetic Appetizer. I used A Curse for True Love because I absolutely love that cover. I think it's beautiful. I also got TBR Hangover Cure, which they list as being that book you didn't quite get to in 2023 can finally be ticked off your to be read list. I did want to read Fourth Wing throughout most of 2023 after starting to sort of get into the booktube scene a little bit. So I put Fourth Wing down for that one. And then I have 2 on the other side. So Whirlwind Romance, I've used Divine Rivals, and for women's rights, I used The Ballad of Never After. So we're making our way through that, about halfway through at this point. There's 8 books total and I have done 4. So that's working out pretty well. Last year I did also attempt to complete the QBD reading challenge for 2023, so I'm going to try to do that again in 2024. I'm doing less of a focus on actually trying to find books that match these prompts and just sort of reading whatever I feel like and hoping that I can match them to something. So out of the QBD reading challenge, I have managed to get all 6 of my January books onto the QBD reading challenge. So under the international, I will link to the QBD reading challenge, and I'll also hopefully chuck it up here like I've done in the past. Under the international holiday category, I achieved the Long Haul Flight book, which was a 500 plus page book, which was of course Iron Flame. In new experiences, I got the First Time Visitor, which was the first book in a series, and I've used Divine Rivals for that one. There was also a new experience, we got Let's Go Girls, which was just a book written by a woman. I used A Curse for True Love. And then there was a dragon specific one, so dragging you on a new adventure, which is a story with dragons, and I of course used Fourth Wing. Then under must see sites we had my fantasy destination, A Magical Journey. I got the Ballad of Never After, and then a popular destination, a top 100 book, I used Yellowface. QBD reading challenge has 24 books, so as long as I'm doing like 2 a month, shouldn't be too bad. And the final challenge that I have recently come across is a little book challenge by a YouTube channel. I believe they're called Book Roast. I will link them up here. I hope that's the right side. It might be up here. I never know. Either way, I will link them at the top somewhere. And this is called Adventure in Aldea, I think is how she pronounces it. You'll have to go to her channel and check it out for sure. But basically, this is just a 1 book a month. This is probably really hard to read because it is quite small. But again, I will link to her channel and she will, on all of her stuff, you'll be able to find it all. It has just 1 book a month, which is pretty easy. And it's sort of like a choose a path sort of situation. So for January, you could choose to either, well, it has a bit of a story to it. So basically you are stuck in a dungeon and you need to get out. In January you could choose to either rely on your strength, which would mean to read a physical book, or you could rely on your wits, which would be listen to an audiobook. I don't really listen to audiobooks, so I went with a physical book, and I've just put Iron Flame on here because it was the book that I had most recently read when I discovered this. So now that I've gone over to this side in February, I have a couple of choices here. Get it in close. So yeah, I can either read a book that is 100 pages longer than my average, or a book with non-human characters. So a couple of options there, and we're going to be trying to work our way through this one. She has like a whole big RPG thing set up that goes along with this. You can create a character, you can join guilds, it's a whole thing. I don't have the level of commitment necessary or the time right now to start trying to set that entire thing up, so I'm not doing the whole RPG thing, but I am going to try to do the little book challenge. She does say that you can do the book challenge separately to everything else, so yeah. I'm just going to do the book challenge and we will see how this one goes. Again, I'm not super trying to pick things. Obviously I just did my TBR jar for prompts, so it's not like I'm using these as prompts in order to pick my books or anything like that. Maybe next year I will start trying to incorporate prompts from these sorts of challenges into my TBR jar, but for now, with the prompts that I already have plus the Goodreads challenge that I'm also trying to give myself, because that's the other challenge, I haven't mentioned that one of all these challenges. This is way too many challenges. I've definitely overloaded myself, but we're just gonna have fun. Whether or not I make them doesn't really matter. But the other one that I am working on that I completely forgot about is my Goodreads challenge. So I'm trying to win every book that won a Goodreads award for 2023, excluding the non-fiction books. So this month, if you are keeping up with any of the Goodreads stuff, we read Divine Rivals was one of the Goodreads winners for, I believe that was young adult fantasy. I'm gonna have to pull it up actually. So yes, Yellowface was the fiction winner for the Goodreads Choice Awards in 2023. I also read Fourth Wing, which was the romantasy winner, and I read Divine Rivals, which was the young adult fantasy winner. And other than that, I think I have also read Happy Place, which was the romance winner. So we've got 4 out of 11 books of the Goodreads winners. I have so far read 4, but some of these are sequels, so I have to read more than 11 books. I think the total number of books I have to read is 14, and I have so far read 4. So we're on our way, but we're not moving there particularly quickly. This one's going to be like a June-July video of all the Goodreads winners. It's a little ways off, but that's okay. We're slowly working our way towards that as well. So yeah, definitely given myself way too many reading challenges, but whichever one I keep managing to achieve is the one that we're going to keep working on. And we'll see how that goes. But anyway, that is all of the books that I read in January. If you want to check out my February TBR, I will have that video linked up the top. So yeah, if you want to check out what I'm going to be reading throughout the month, which we are like in the middle of by the time you guys see this video, you can check that out. I'll also of course be doing another review of all the books I read in February once we get to March, so if you're interested in seeing that, don't forget to subscribe so that you don't miss any of my upcoming booktube content. If you enjoyed this video, also please like the video. I would really appreciate it. Feel free to comment whatever you like. Say hello. Tell me what books you enjoyed in January. Yeah, do that. What was your favourite book in January of 2024? Or your most interesting book? What was your most interesting read? Let me know in the comments. Yeah, that's gonna be it. Thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate it, and I'll see you in the next video. Goodbye. Now I gotta put this stack of books away again.